The Crown and Māori have had a tenuous relationship, to say the least. There have been some ups and some major downs. Ultimately, this is a result of a land being colonised by a foreign crown without consent, and with a lot of inequality in the process.
So it's no surprise that a relationship that wasn't fully asked for and that isn't entirely equal has caused some problems.
At the moment, Māori and Pākehā have a stronger relationship than ever, but it's definitely not perfect, and it has taken decades of hard work and activism to get to the point where we are now. And there is still a lot of work to do.
So to understand how we got there, we should probably check our history quickly.
Aotearoa, New Zealand, was the last place in the world to be inhabited by people. It was discovered sometime around the 1200s by Polynesian wayfinders from East Polynesia. Between 1200-ish and 1840, New Zealand was populated almost exclusively by Māori. There was no single group of people, as each iwi exercised self-determination over their domain. This means that rather than the concept of a nation, Aotearoa wasn't viewed as a single state with a controlling government and property rights. Instead, different iwi had kaitiakitanga, or guardianship over the lands they inhabited. However, some would argue that the Declaration of Independence of the United Tribes of New Zealand, which was accepted by the British King at the time, symbolised that New Zealand pre-1840 was actually seen in international terms as a nation. Māori populated almost all of the North Island and a lot of the South Island. Then, when Europeans started migrating in huge numbers, conflict began.
The story of the Crown and Māori doesn't actually start with the Crown. It starts with Abel Tasman, a Dutch explorer, when he discovered New Zealand in about 1642. You often hear about when New Zealand was discovered. However, this is only in history books that tell a very European view of the world. In fact, Māori discovered New Zealand 300 years beforehand. The legend goes that it was by an explorer named Kupe. The Europeans wouldn't return again until James Cook sailed around New Zealand in 1769 for the British. Settlers and traders started arriving in New Zealand from Australia and the British Empire pretty soon after it, though it only increased exponentially in the 1800s. Alright, so that's probably enough of a breakdown of the first 600 or so years of New Zealand history.
In 1840, the relationship between Māori and the Crown became official, at least in the way that international law was understood at the time and the sovereignty that exists now. Again, this is a point of contestation. As mentioned before, in 1835, several iwi across Aotearoa got together and signed the Declaration of Independence of the United Tribes of New Zealand. The United Tribes provided protection of the British subjects in New Zealand at the time, in return for King William's protection against threats to their mana. Furthermore, King William acknowledged the tribe's flag, which allowed them to trade more frequently with the British colonies across the Tasman. Thus, while many would argue official relations between Māori and the Crown started in 1840, international relations between the two nations occurred well before this. The Treaty of Waitangi, which was a rush job, was put together a couple of days before the 6th of February 1840. It was an international treaty that confirmed British obligations to Māori and Māori and British rights in New Zealand. There were two versions though.
The English version gave complete control over New Zealand to the British. The Māori version, known as Te Treaty of Waitangi, which was written overnight the night before it was presented, was not the same. It said that Māori would still remain in control of New Zealand, and that the Crown would govern settler populations. The Māori version said that the Crown would have kawanatanga over New Zealand, which is a rough translation for governorship. The English version said that the Crown would have absolute sovereignty over New Zealand. Most modern experts in treaty law and Māori studies agree that had rangatira understood the English version, fewer would have signed the treaty.
Another fundamental difference, which has been a hot topic for the past few decades, is the difference between Māori having tino rangatiratanga over taonga and them having full exclusive and undisturbed possession of lands and estates, forests, fisheries and other properties. Māori understood that they would have complete control over all things valuable to Māori. This would have included their culture, land, people and language, whereas the English version only protected Māori property rights. We don't know whether the English purposefully changed the wording of the Māori version to make it more palatable, or if they genuinely didn't understand the implications of the wording. Odds are, and what most experts believe nowadays, is that it was a mix of both.
The English imposed a Western concept, an international treaty, on the different rangatira. The English tried to group all of the iwi and hapu under one Māori label so that they could impose obligations on everyone in the country. This was another contentious issue that many rangatira did not understand well enough to make a well-informed decision, which again added to the discrepancies between what the Māori and the English were thinking at Waitangi. So why was the treaty signed if it wasn't made properly?
Well, there had been a push by groups of Māori and Europeans to get the Crown involved in policing the European settlers. Russell, or Kororareka, in the Bay of Islands had become to be known as the hellhole of the Pacific because of the drunken and bad-mannered traders and sailors that came on the settler ships. On top of that, Māori had started working on some of the trading and whaling ships between New Zealand and Australia, so they became more aware of the valuable British trading network. Rangatira were beginning to realise that it would be a good idea to form a formal relationship with the British to A, get protection from the settlers, and B, improve their trading links. So, hopefully that frames the context around the treaty a little bit better.
Effectively, the Crown wanted to sort out the status of New Zealand ASAP to stop the French doing it, and to control the English settlers. And the Māori wanted the English settlers to be under control, and to start trading with the Crown. Sadly though, the most important legal event in New Zealand history went down because of the rush job, the lack of care by the Crown in ensuring that Māori understood the treaty in the same way, and the assumptions made during the negotiations at Waitangi. Weirdly enough, after the treaty was signed, there was actually quite a lot of optimism. The ramifications of the treaty wouldn't be recognised for many years, and the relationship between the Crown and the iwi was, for the most part, quite strong. Māori still made up the majority of the population, and New Zealand was prospering because of the new trade.
It was only when the mass waves of British immigration started in the 1860s that the issues between the Māori and the Crown started to really flare up. By the end of the 1850s, Māori were more reluctant to sell land, and the Crown was struggling to buy enough for settlers. When Māori refused to sell land in Taranaki, the New Zealand Wars started. These wars resulted in the British taking 95% of New Zealand's total land for Crown use, while dispossessing Māori of their rights to control and govern their lands is guaranteed to them under the treaty. These wars were when the relationship between the Crown and Māori changed forever. The land confiscations by the British troops after the wars led to resentment from the Māori, and many would argue rightly so. From this point onwards, colonisation really started to kick off. Māori were subjugated to second-class citizens in their own lands. They were caned for speaking te reo. They were forced into labouring work. The court system actively worked against them and suggested that their first line of defence, the Treaty of Waitangi, was a simple nullity. Also, for the first time, the Māori population was now significantly lower than the settlers. This meant the Crown now really had control over the country.
Okay, but how is any of this relevant to you? First and foremost, it's relevant to you because you live on land that was stolen. Now, this is going to be very hard to accept, and there will be all kinds of deflectionary behavior to try and get around this issue, but it's true. The land we all live on, it was stolen. But it's too late to go back and correct the wrongs of the past. All we can do is work to ensure that our government honours the Treaty of Waitangi. That will do justice to the fact that the land we live on is stolen. That will do justice to the fact that we have all benefited from the dispossessing Māori of their land and livelihoods. And all of this starts with education. Colonisation is an extant system, which means it doesn't die out just because we say it should. Colonisation is all around us, and we can see signs of it when we focus enough. Māori currently make up 52.8% of the prison population, while only making up 15% of the total population. Māori are poorly represented in health statistics and educational outcomes. All of this didn't come out of thin air. It comes from the historical trauma felt by Māori generation after generation.
The UN has also provided various reports to New Zealand calling on more recognition for Indigenous rights, suggesting increases in funding to the Waitangi Tribunal, improved access to health services and social services for Māori, and law reform to address the racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, amongst others. If you should take one thing away from this module, it is that we are still working on developing a better relationship between Māori and the Crown. But we can't sit back and let it take its own course. That will result in further inequality. We need to demand that the government abides by their obligations to Māori. We need to call out behaviours and attitudes that stereotype and alienate Māori. But most of all, we need to support Māori in their endeavours to gain self-determination over themselves and their land. Then, and only then, will we ever be able to be in a position to move forward.
So, to recap what we went over today. First, we looked at an incredibly brief history of New Zealand immigration.
Then, we talked about how and why the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. And finally, we talked about how it is playing out in modern New Zealand and how much work there is still left to do for each and every one of us.